I, Daenerys of House Targaryen, first of my name, breaker of chains and mother of dragons, sentence you to die. Dracarys.
Hola, comrades! Today's topic of interest, Game of Thrones. Jumping the shark is a term for when a work, especially a TV show, turns away from the core formula that made it successful and becomes only a shell of its former self. Contrary to the Wikipedia definition of the term, this has little to do with popularity. It has everything to do with quality. To jump the shark, a show has to do more than become significantly worse. It has to become worse while betraying its original ideals. It has to abandon what originally made it work. Think of Dexter becoming too enamored with its main character to seriously interrogate him for his crimes. While masterpieces like Breaking Bad and Mad Men can go their entire runs without threatening to jump the shark, shows that are great but not all-time classics constantly risk having this happen, and there is no better example of this in the contemporary television landscape than Game of Thrones. The core of that show used to be that anyone can die. Actions have consequences. If a hero does something foolish, they will die. The two most famous examples of this are Ned Stark's death in episode 109, Baelor, and the Red Wedding in episode 309, The Reigns of Castamere. These two events, combined with the series' general desire to subvert traditional fantasy tropes, earned it the reputation of being smart fantasy for adults. However, in Season 7, it stopped being daring. There are many reasons why the show stopped being good in Season 7. For example, it introduced a number of storylines that obviously only existed to fill time, such as the pointless, shallow conflict between Sansa and Arya in Winterfell, and its struggle to find a rationale for why Dany doesn't just attack. It turned Cersei from being a mad queen to being a strangely brilliant strategist. There was also a reliance on the idea that the squabbles over who rules the kingdoms are irrelevant when the White Walkers are approaching. Regardless of the merits of this idea in of itself, it is strange coming from a show that has been trying to engender interest in these squabbles for half a decade. Season 7 focused less on setup and more on execution, thereby zapping its execution of weight and gravitas. However, as a longtime fan of the show, and especially the books on which it was based, I would have been able to forgive the show for not being good if it had stayed daring. However, constantly the characters found themselves in situations that should have killed them, but they survived simply because the plot needed them alive. This happens far too often, especially in regards to Jon and Daenerys. But the worst example of this is when Bronn and Jaime survive the battle with Daenerys' dragons. This is precisely when Game of Thrones jumped the shark. In his essay, Game of Thrones, or The Pain of Falling Out of Love with a Story, Sage Hyden of Just Right compares Season 7 to the Titanic sinking, but this episode is where there could be no doubting that the ship was going to sink. The message of saving these two characters at this juncture is clear. Important characters can no longer die whenever. This is antithetical to the spirit of Game of Thrones, and this is what dooms the show. Instead of trying to escape from how it undercuts itself by keeping Bronn and Jaime alive, it digs itself deeper. It continues following the path it chose by keeping those two alive, and in doing so, it strangles itself. Showrunners Benioff and Weiss do not understand why their show has been so successful. In an article bemoaning modern TV's tendency toward cheap death, Todd Vanderwerf contrasts the brutal power of Ned's death with the absurd number of cheap deaths inspired by it. The problem with most TV deaths, he argues, is pretty simple. They're frequently devoid of meaning, inserted into the plot only to create shock and boost a show's profile on Twitter. Game of Thrones not only taught the wrong lessons to modern television, it taught the wrong lessons to itself. There's a lot of death in Season 7, but it matters less. Game of Thrones didn't capture the zeitgeist just because it killed characters. Any show can do that. Game of Thrones captured the zeitgeist because it killed sympathetic characters in meaningful ways. It should not have to be said that killing Robb Stark, a young, handsome, brave leader who fit perfectly into a heroic archetype, that of the moral prince attempting to avenge his father, is not the same as killing a side character with precious little personality. Depressingly, this attempt to fulfill traditional fantasy tropes while pretending like it's subverting those tropes became the series' highest rated season ever. Game of Thrones has conquered the world. It doesn't have to be good anymore, it only has to be enormous and exciting. It can afford to have its characters act like morons and come up with terrible plans, and it can afford to shift focus to the White Walkers, who make terribly uninteresting antagonists, so long as it features scenes of dragons incinerating minor characters and Jon and Dany falling for each other. As Hayden discusses in his video, falling out of love with a story is a painful experience. It's hard for one to admit a show they loved isn't as good as it once was, particularly considering, as Hayden puts it, falling out of love with a story doesn't mean you start to hate it, but rather that you start to not care about it. Game of Thrones is not the show it was, but that has not stopped fans from pretending it hasn't lost a step. In an article for Gizmodo bluntly titled, "Jon Snow Must Die," Alex Cran states, "So when I hear people saying Jon Snow is going to marry Daenerys and become king and have babies and rule over all Westeros, I've got to look at the camera office style, as that interpretation suggests a gross misreading of the text." To be fair to Kranz, her article is less an argument about what the show is going to do than what it should do, but implicit in that article is the assumption that the show will do what she believes it should. This is faith in the showrunners that they stopped earning after the disaster of Season 7. No, for the record, I do not believe everything is going to turn out perfectly for Jon and Daenerys, but I also see no reason to believe the show is going to have a massively subversive ending. I believe the heroes will suffer losses, but ultimately good will triumph, as it does in every conventional fantasy story. Game of Thrones may have started as a show where, as Kranz puts it, heroes weren't safe, villains could win, and everything was terribly hard for everyone, but it has since become a show about invincible heroes and simplistic villains. It has become a show where the tension and stakes it wants to have and the tension and stakes it actually has are completely different. It has become clear that neither the characters nor the writers are thinking very hard about their plans. The show has become predictable and inert. It's worse than a parody of itself, because at least a good Game of Thrones parody would kill characters that matter in somewhat appropriate ways. The show has forgotten what it is, or else it never properly understood what made it work. The larger question is why this happened. The easy answer is to say Benioff and Weiss ran out of books to adapt and didn't know what to do, but that's a little too simplistic. Yes, Benioff and Weiss deserve a percentage of the blame. This is not a defense of them. They're surprisingly easy to dislike considering the popularity of the show they've created. Compare them to Breaking Bad's clever Vince Gilligan, or Mad Men's erudite Matthew Weiner, or The Sopranos' crusty yet wise David Chase, and their deficiencies become apparent. They're not morons, but that their understanding of narrative craft and character work is far below that of the best showrunners is evident. Benioff once seriously said themes are for 8th grade book reports, and while that was more of an offhand comment than a steadfast declaration of purpose, it nevertheless reveals a level of ignorance that is nothing less than staggering. That quote is something you'd expect to come from the mouth of a 35-year-old dude working at Goldman Sachs who thinks he's smarter than his high school English teacher because he wears fancy suits and talks tough. Those who don't believe that quote and Season 7 of Game of Thrones, not to mention all the ignorant interviews he's given about the controversies the show has evoked, make a strong enough case against him, consider that he wrote 2 meat-headed, underwhelming scripts for major films, one for Troy, the other for X-Men Origins, Wolverine. And Weiss is no better. Both by himself and with Benioff, his work outside Game of Thrones has been underwhelming. However, having to transition from adapting a pre-existing work to creating original content is a difficult task for anyone, especially in the case of A Song of Ice and Fire. The last 2 books Martin wrote, A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, leave the world so scrambled that pulling the disparate pieces together is next to impossible. Martin himself has struggled with this. It's the most significant reason why the books have not been finished yet, even though the first one was released before I was born. The last 2 books are effectively 2 halves of one very long novel. Martin split the work while attempting to solve what he called the Milanese knot, meaning his attempts to bring all the characters together for the conclusion. As of the end of Book 5, there is still no definitive nod to what the endgame could be. other than a war between humans and White Walkers. Martin's insistence on trope breaking has gotten him into a place where he doesn't know how to pull all the narrative threads together. Benioff and Weiss's solution appears to be to abandon the trope breaking, lean on the tropes the series once subverted, and make the series satisfying in a way it was not supposed to be. As much flack as the duo have rightfully gotten for this decision, only an all-time great showrunner could have kept true to the series' ethos while propelling it toward an ending. And Benioff and Weiss are, it has become apparent, not all-time great showrunners. Nevertheless, the series fading from an energetic new conception of what fantasy could be to just another high-budget show is disappointing. Ever since it jumped the shark, it's become more akin to a mid-level superhero blockbuster than the transcendent majesty of the Lord of the Rings movies. There is a lot of action, and it's well-staged action, but it lacks narrative heft. Aside from a few baffling narrative decisions, it's not truly a bad series. It's simply one I wish I liked more than I do. Whenever I watch the show, I deeply and passionately want to be invested in it, but whenever an episode ends these days, I'm left shrugging my shoulders and asking, is that it?
You never would have survived what I survived.
I guess we'll never know.
The decline of the TV series is particularly painful considering my attachment to the books. During 8th grade, one of my friends, with whom I had a friendly rivalry, started reading the books, so I started reading them too, and I was enthralled by their depth and daring. I became immersed in the worlds and the characters. Even compared to The Lord of the Rings, these books were mammoth, and I devoured them voraciously because of that. This was a time when I was waiting for my life to begin, yearning for the future, and here were these immense works of fiction offering me one of the most complex and fascinating worlds I had ever seen. They took over my adolescent life. I wasn't even a particularly avid reader, but I adored the books. I'd even have called them some of the best books of the last 50 years. I don't think I'd say that anymore. Growing up has made me more akin to the books' faults and limitations. As a prose stylist, Martin is better than Rowling, but he's not exceptional, and like Rowling, he struggles to tie everything together. Still, even considering the problems I now have with the books, I still say they deserve better than what the show has become. The Sopranos was a subversive series that had a subversive ending. Why shouldn't Game of Thrones, which Benioff and Weiss picked as The Lord of the Rings meets The Sopranos, follow suit? Anyway, if you liked what you saw today, consider donating to my Patreon so I can produce even more fantastical content. Also, don't forget to like and comment and subscribe, all that unnecessarily important stuff. Adios, comrades!